Good morning, Bucknutters. It is Tuesday, August 9th, 2022. I am Dan Rubin. This is the Bucknuts Morning 5 and Change. Happy to be joined today by Andrew Ivins from 247Sports, our Southeast recruiting analyst. If you're on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, you can see him now in front of his esteemed bookcase, the standard fine journalist background that he has. I'm still working on mine, and I will get there. But he is here today to answer all of our questions on Ohio State's recruiting efforts in the Southeast area, primarily Florida. He's a South Florida guy, and you'll know if I have him on the show, I think very highly of him. Andrew is part of what I believe, and I've been working at in 247 Sports since the beginning of it. The way we have it set up now with our guys, with Bill Kurlick for us here, and Andrew in South Florida, and Steve Wolfong, et cetera, that we are really on top of things. I'm super comfortable with where we are. I'm not always have been, but now we are, and we're rolling. So, Andrew, I want to welcome you to the show, and also maybe tell everybody a little bit about, a quick history for you at 24/7 and your area and your background, because as I said before we did the show, we were going over offers, and Ohio State has more offers out in Florida than anywhere else. So let's start at the top.
Yeah, so I live in Fort Lauderdale. I kind of call it ground zero, right? I'm right by St. Thomas Aquinas, Chaminade, Madonna Prep, American Heritage, Cardinal Gibbons. I mean, that's all a 15-minute drive for me. So this is the base, and I've been in this current role for about 3 years. Before that, I was covering Miami. Before that, I was actually covering Notre Dame for a little bit. Believe it or not, I don't think a lot of people know that about me, but I'm originally from Florida, went to Florida Atlantic. I actually went up to Ohio State when FAU played there a few years ago. Yeah, and that was quite an eye-opening experience for me. I remember seeing Chase Young next to FAU's huddle, and he towered over everyone. So that's what I do. Florida's my state. It's a big state. Georgia is as well. But I try to make as many trips as I can and get out on the road. And my big thing is seeing guys. I love to see guys from the start and then see them blossom into a college player and eventually an NFL guy.
Yeah, so one thing you're going to find out today is these are going to be a lot of names that you have heard before at Bucknuts, but you haven't really heard the twist, and Andrew has, because he's seen all these guys from the very start. Just like when you hear Mark Porter talk about a guy from Youngstown in 8th grade, at the same time, our guy Andrew was in Florida getting a tan while Mark was all bundled up in Youngstown. God knows why he made that decision. But anyway, I digress. Let's start at the top with, I have it written down as my notes, as the cornerback turns, and that is Dijon Johnson, mustard. Been a very interesting recruitment. I was joking with Andrew before the show that even though this is live, we may get scooped because the news has changed so much. Could you please bring us totally up to speed on Dijon in terms of a recruiting perspective, what you think is going to happen, what has happened, and then maybe a little bit about the dude?
Yeah, so Dijon, he's at Tampa Wharton High School, obviously outside on Tampa. I actually texted him right before the show, just said, hey, you got news coming, just so we didn't get scooped. And he told me he's not ready to make a decision just yet. So let's start from the jump with this kid. I remember seeing him at Florida's Friday Night Lights camp a year ago, and I didn't really know much about Dijon Johnson. He had a few offers, and then as he played his junior season, he quickly rose up recruiting boards around the country. He moved up in our rankings. He looked really good at the Under Armour camp they had in Miami. And then everyone was kind of on board. And another thing I don't think a lot of the average people know is, from what I heard, at one time, Dijon was actually silently committed to USC. His coach is Mike Williams. And yes, that Mike Williams, the Mike Williams that played wide receiver at USC, that's the head coach at Tampa Wharton. He visited USC a few times. I guess gave them a silent. And then as we got to the summer months, he visits Ohio State and flips his commitment. Now, I think he probably wants to go to Ohio State. I think that's a school he feels very comfortable with. But there's been some changing pieces. I think NIL is playing a little bit of factor. There's also some stuff back home that has changed in Dijon's life. So when that July period opened up and he could go out on the road and visit schools, he was at Florida on a Tuesday. It's about a 2-hour drive from where he is, Gainesville to Tampa, 2.5, depending on the day of the week. And then he returned for their Friday Night Lights cookout and camp. He didn't work out, but you saw him interacting with some of those commits. And kind of the buzz, as soon as he backed off that verbal pledge to Ohio State, is, hey, he's going to flip to Florida. Well, that hasn't happened yet. And I don't think he's going to make a decision or rush into anything. I know one other school involved in the recruitment is Miami. They're working on getting him on campus for a visit. He has visited in the past, but I think they would love to get an official visit. Florida also, they're going to keep chipping away at it. But I do think what I started hearing over the weekend is that Ohio State, there's no gap to close, but I think Ohio State's still alive. And normally you don't see a kid decommit and recommit to a school, but I do think Ohio State maybe has found some footing. They've kind of eased things over a little bit. So we'll see. This has been all over the place, right? So whatever commitment he makes, a lot of people thinking it's commitment number 2. It's actually number 3 if you count that USC silent pledge. And the rule of thumb kind of in Florida is you don't want the kid's second commitment. You want that third commitment. So we'll see what happens with Dijon, but doesn't sound like any news imminent. And of course, I'll say that. And then, the next thing he's tweeting out a commitment, but we'll see.
Let's just take this right off the top, because you addressed the parable for the third commitment, which is just silly in and of itself. But every time we get a commitment, or Ohio State gets a commitment from a Florida kid, especially when it's younger, when it's not like near signing day, everyone's assumption is, all right, let's wait it out. These Florida kids commit early. I don't know if the term you want to use is flaky, impressionable, guys who like to take trips or game the system. We don't have a thing in Ohio about committing to your third school and that one be the one that stick. Ours is last visit, usually, not last commitment. So you be the one to give us the Florida side. Do you think the guys are shady? Is it just the way it works?
So
is it a parental deal?
So I think you got to take a step back, right? And, it wasn't until recently someone explained this whole dynamic to me. South Florida is very unique. The kids grow up playing year round. You grow up playing in a park, right? And you play in the park until you're about to go to middle school. But the high school coaches come down to that park and they select the best kids. So essentially, from a young teenager standpoint, you are being recruited. You will grow up understanding that, hey, I have to perform if I want to go to the best high school, right? Then a lot of these kids, they get to the high school and sometimes maybe they don't go to the best high school. They go to a lower level program. Well, hey, they know if they perform by the time they are a junior or senior, they're going to be poached by one of these private schools or another one big public school. And what does that all mean? I'm just saying these kids grow up knowing that if I perform well, I can get recruited to go somewhere else. And I think that kind of spills into the culture and the lifestyle just of South Florida. Everyone sees football as a ticket out. I mean, I was at Miami Edison High School with some college coaches, and it was crazy to me. The principal, he grew up in Miami-Dade, went to school in Idaho, played 4 years and graduated and came back. And when I was talking to him, he basically said, hey, man, my neighborhood, you will go anywhere to play and get an education. And everyone in that neighborhood is going to push you to do that. I mean, that is the ticket to success. So I think that plays a little bit into this whole thing where these kids know that their performance and what they're able to do is going to get them better opportunities. And I think sometimes people in that community, in that neighborhood, they're going to push kids in different directions. So I think it gets a little confusing. And that's just kind of the nature of the beast in South Florida. And I'm not saying that makes it acceptable to make 2-3 commitments, but I think that's just the way of life down here in Sunshine, in Miami-Dade County, in Broward County. I mean, that's just how it is.
And listen, there's a reason people keep going back, and there's a reason people take those commitments knowing they might boogie. It's that the talent level down there is just obscene. And we'll get to that when you start to hear the numbers about the class of 2024 and where Ohio State's offers are. I think it'll show that to you. All right, we want to talk a little bit about the guys we know are coming to play for Ohio State in the class of 2023. I'm going to give you the names, and then you can kind of wax poetic on them. Obviously, the 3 receivers, Carnell, Tate, though not a Florida native, is at IMG, which is, I'm sure you have a cot there somewhere. And then, of course, Brandon Inniss, who we all know, who's kind of been, as Steve Wilfong told us, probably the most well-known recruit Ohio State has gotten from a national perspective. And then I remember hearing about him in the 8th grade, even up here. And then let's talk about Cedrick Hawkins, and then finish with Mark Fletcher.
Okay, so let's start with Carnell Tate. You're right. He is originally from Chicago, but he's at IMG Academy. He was there last season. He also played 7-on-7 for the South Florida Express. So I have a ton of exposure to him. He's a guy where I don't know if there's one thing he does exceptionally well, but I think he does a lot of everything well. Like he does everything good. All right. I think if I had to pick one aspect of his game that surprises me the most or I love the most, it's his ball skills. And as dumb as this sounds, I go back to last season where he makes a diving catch and goes and gets a ball. And yes, elite wide receivers should make that type of catch, but oftentimes they don't, right? I mean, the guys that do make those catches are the ones that are playing on Sunday. So when I look at Carnell Tate, he's a 4.7 guy on the lasers, but to me, I like his play style. I like his route running. And then I always go back to the spring scrimmage IMG Academy had, and I've tweeted this video out. I've always brought it up. There's I think it was a run by Stacy Gage, or maybe it was Jarrett Gibson, kind of bounces outside, and Carnell Tate takes off from across the field and runs 40 yards full sprint just to give a little nudge to help Jarrett Gibson get into the end zone, just nudge a defender a little bit. And to me, that shows that he's football smart. That shows that he cares. And that shows that he's going to do the little things. And I think all that stuff's important. You put him with Brian Hartline in that zone 6 wide receiver room, I think he's going to flourish. So, I'm a huge fan of Carnell Tate. And I love Brandon Inniss. You mentioned him as an 8th grader. I've actually gone back, and I think he's been the alpha dog of more events I've attended than anyone else in my career. I mean, he's always been a 7-on-7 all-star. He's produced on Friday nights in Broward County against really good competition since he was in 8th grade. And to me, the thing that stands out about Brandon Inniss is the fact that he hates to lose. Okay. I go back to when he was at True Prep Academy and they were playing St. Thomas Aquinas. I think it was 2 years ago, right after that COVID break. And Brandon Inniss was by far the best player on his team. And they're going up against the powerhouse that is St. Thomas Aquinas. And Brandon is running up and down the sidelines, getting snaps on both sides of the ball and on special teams. And he's screaming at his teammates. And to me, he is someone that hates to lose, and he's going to let everyone else in the locker room know that. I think he's going to be a coach's favorite. I think he's going to be a guy that has the facility's door code memorized. He's always going to be in there. And yeah, he might not be the fastest. He might lack measurables, but I know on Friday nights or Saturdays, Brandon Inniss, you're going to get 110% from him. And I think he's been on the scene so long that, hey, maybe we've overthinking it. Like, we know what he is. And I'm super excited to see him at Ohio State because, again, I think he will flourish as well.
Bryson Rodgers?
He's an interesting one. He last season, I think if any of you saw Bryson Rodgers, you're not going to be blown away by his height, his weight, his speed. But kind of like with Carnell Tate, he does all the little things well. He doesn't do anything great, but he's very solid across the board. And I go back to the OT7, that tournament in June. He really kind of had a coming out party, I would say. And, he made a name for himself. He's super consistent. I think if you're, if he's going to be your number 4 wide receiver, obviously they have Noah Rodgers also committed. I mean, that's unreal. That guy could be a wide receiver 1, a wide receiver 2, probably at 30 Power 5 schools around the country. I think Bryson, he might not put up the numbers he did this year. I actually saw him in his spring game against Tampa Berkeley Prep, who has Keon Keeley, the 5-star committed to Notre Dame, the edge rusher. And Bryson, I think his numbers are going to regress a little bit. Last year he played he was the top target for Rocco Becht, Anthony Becht's son, quarterback who ended up signing with Iowa State. So I think there's going to be some growing pains there, but I would not be surprised if Bryson Rodgers goes to Ohio State, waits his turn, and then eventually parlays that into a spot in the NFL. And I think he has the right mindset. I think he knows where he stands with all these guys, and he's going to embrace competition. And I think if you're Ohio State, that's exactly what you're looking for.
All right, let's finish with Cedrick Hawkins and Mark Fletcher, 2 guys who maybe don't get the fanfare, especially Fletcher, because I think people thought he was going to be part of a 2-back system, and that may not be the case. So your thoughts?
Cedrick, he's a 3-year contributor so far, who's got excellent ball skills. I think the thing for me, I'm interested to see how that body and that frame fills out. He's kind of wiry, and we always thought maybe he would add some size, and that hasn't happened yet. So interested to see if he takes a step here as a senior. And then obviously when he gets to Ohio State, you're going to be eating at a training table, right? You're going to be lifting in some type of developmental group. So want to see a little bit more from him. But at the end of the day, I mean, guy who's played in 30 games for a storied Cocoa program. I mean, right. Give me that all day. Mark Fletcher. I love Mark Fletcher. I go back to that pandemic year. I was talking to the coaches at American Heritage, and they're like, "Hey, Mark Fletcher's this big guy now." They're like, "He's 6'1", 225." I'm like, "There's no way." Well, sure enough, I show up to a workout, and I made Mark Fletcher get on the scale, and I think he was over 225 pounds. I mean, he is a big battering ram of a running back. I don't know if he's going to be a featured guy that gets 25, 30 carries, but I think he's someone that can be part of a committee. And I think he can do, everything you want. He can catch the ball out of the backfield. He can chip as a blocker. And more importantly, if you need 3 yards, he's going to get you 4 yards. And we've seen a little bit of that. So I think that was a nice take for Ohio State. I will say this, Mark has kind of dealt with some lingering shoulder issues. I think he had something cleaned up in the shoulder a while back. So that's something you got to keep an eye on. But last year, I mean, under 1,000 yards rushing. Let's not forget American Heritage lost their starting quarterback, and Brandon Inniss had to fill in that role. Right. And essentially, I mean, everyone just stacked the box, and it was a pretty bad year for American Heritage. So I wouldn't be surprised if Mark comes out and, gets things back on track and runs for a ton of yards.
All right, that's great stuff. We're now going to move to 2024. First, for those people on the podcast, we're going to take a 5-second break to sell some ads. And we are back. I was mistaken there. I jumped to 2024 a little early, lest we forget that Andrew also does some work in Georgia. Can you please tell me what you think of Kayin Lee and Jelani Thurman?
Well, I think on my scouting report for Kayin Lee, I describe him as like a lunch pail type of cornerback. He's under 6 foot. He's actually added some weight since when I saw him back in the spring months. But to me, I mean, this is the ideal kind of nickel slot defender, a guy that's going to be aggressive in man coverage, and he is not afraid to hit people. And I think you need that in the Big Ten. I mean, we've seen where that conference is kind of. You need your slot defender to be able to come up and nail a Mark Fletcher type running back. And I think Kayin Lee's a guy that can do that. I think it's a really good get for Ohio State, one that maybe flew under the radar. And I'll say this, when Kayin decommitted from Georgia, I texted all the other analysts. I'm like, hey, we are not moving this kid down in the rankings. I think he can play. I think maybe Georgia, they want to go in a different direction, and that's fine by them. But let's not move off of this. So I'm glad he's headed to Ohio State. I believe in Kayin Lee. He made some big plays in Georgia's 3A state title game last year. So really like that. Jelani Thurman, he's a specimen. His dad played in the NFL, played in the WNBA, and he also is a talented basketball player. He's got a D1 basketball offer I think to Stetson. He was at the Future 50. I saw him at a few other off-season events, and he's just got a monster catch radius. And some of my colleagues kind of, dog me for this player comparison, but I think he's kind of like a Mike Gesicki, who's now with the Miami Dolphins. Yeah. To me, I watch a lot of Miami Dolphins. Obviously I'm down here in South Florida, not a fan, but that's what's on TV on Sundays. And Gesicki has this huge catch radius, right? And he's maybe a guy you don't attach as a blocker. And I think they're trying to make him more of a blocker, but he's long and he can go and snag something. And I think Jelani has a similar capability and a similar skill set in terms of he can make some acrobatic grabs. I don't know if he's ever going to be able to anchor against a 280-pound defensive lineman and set the edge. But that's not what they're recruiting him to do. They wanted him to catch passes, and I think he's super talented. And to me, what'll be interesting to see is what happens in a few years from now. Georgia's kind of been billed as tight end U. They took 2 tight ends, Pierce Spurlin, Lawson Lucky, and they passed on Jelani Thurman, who's a legacy. They also passed on Ethan Davis, who's going to head up to Tennessee. I wouldn't be surprised if Thurman and Ethan Davis had better careers than Pierce Berlin and Lawson Lucky. And I know that some people are going to say that's crazy to say, but that's just kind of how I stand by my evaluation, having seen all four of those guys.
So I saw Mike Gesicki, Terry McLaurin, Paris Campbell, and Eric Glover Williams try out in the WAC for Urban Meyer at a June camp. And they wanted Gesicki and Paris Campbell. Eric Glover Williams, who you probably don't even know that name, was the star of the day. It was a 5'9" guy, option quarterback that came to Ohio State and flamed out. They offered Gesicki. They offered Paris Campbell. They told Terry McLaurin, go back and have a great senior year. Maybe we'll offer you. So that tended to work out for Terry because he's one of the major donors in the foundation now because he makes about $25 million a year. So there's always those recruiting stories that line the bottom there. All right, let's talk 2024. As I said, we're going to go as quickly through this as we can. We have taken Andrew for too long, but Ohio State has 70 offers out in the class of 2024. 34 of them are in Florida and Georgia. For an example, we have 19 offers out in Florida, 15 in Georgia, 5 in Ohio. So if you want to know where the focus of the 2024 class is, head south. As always. Now, there are 4 Floridians currently in that have a warm crystal ball to Ohio State. So we're early enough in the process. We're going to nail down these 4. And I'll give you the name and who else he's considering, and then we'll go from there. The guy I want to start with, obviously, is Jeremiah Smith. I've read a ton of your stuff on him. Number 1 wide receiver in 2024, Chaminade Madonna, who you just mentioned earlier. He's the one 2024 player you have crystal ball to Ohio State. You talked a little bit about that after seeing him recently. Can you bring us up to speed on Jeremiah Smith? Maybe give us a comparison so people can get a sense of him and then where you think he'll end up, et cetera.
I still like that crystal ball for Ohio State. I did see him on Saturday at a local little media day, and he was wearing Ohio State sandals. Normally, I don't try to read into that type of stuff, but anytime I ask Jeremiah about Ohio State, you get that smile from him where you can tell that, hey, this might be the one. And why not? I mean, look at what Ohio State has done at the wide receiver position. Why would you not want to go play for Brian Hartline and Zone 6 and all that stuff? So I think Ohio State's in a very good spot here. But with Jeremiah, he's going to go through the recruiting process. And we just talked about South Florida, and you want to be the kid's third commitment, not the second commitment. He's a little bit different. His family has been through this whole thing. Geno Smith, the Seattle Seahawks quarterback who used to be at West Virginia. Yeah. That's his uncle. Yeah, so the family knows what they're doing. They're calculated with this whole thing. I think Alabama is certainly one that could pose a threat to Ohio State. Miami with Mario Cristobal and Josh Gaddis. Those guys have tried to sink their teeth into Jeremiah. And then Florida with Kerry Colbert, who just had a wide receiver go in the first round. And, Billy Napier, the new Gators head coach, he kind of has a wide receiver background, coached Amari Cooper, a bunch of different guys when he was with the Crimson Tide. So, I think there's going to be some battles and some competitions, but this one to me seems like Ohio State is the one that could go wire to wire here. And Jeremiah is not going to admit that the Buckeyes are his leader, but that's the sense I get. That's the sense you get talking with some other people. You got to credit Ohio State. I mean, they've done an excellent job. They got Jeremiah up there with the South Florida Express. Keenan Bailey, who's in an off the field role for the Buckeyes. He's super plugged in down in South Florida. Went to Cardinal Gibbons High School, has ties in Fort Lauderdale. I think he's able to connect with a lot of kids. He was a big reason why the Buckeyes got Ryan Turner, who's also from Chaminade Madonna Prep 2 cycles ago. He's also a big reason why they got Brandon Inniss and Mark Fletcher. So I think Keenan will have a huge role in Jeremiah Smith. But I like my crystal ball right now. Jeremiah, I don't think he told me any Ohio State games he's got penciled in. He's planning to get to LSU. I think Cincinnati, he's got some staff tied to someone at Cincinnati, Tennessee as well. But I wouldn't be surprised if he shows up in Columbus for a game next few months.
Bill had a thing on him yesterday. I believe he just committed to go to the Notre Dame game.
Nice.
Which, good Lord, that's going to be a cavalcade of stars.
And then you already talked about him as a player, right? So most people aren't familiar. He's 6'3", 180 pounds. And what I always tell people when I bring up Jeremiah is he's like a puppy, right? So you see him and he's got these big paws and he's got these big feet, and he's not done growing. And I think he's a guy that could ultimately end up being 6'5", 200 pounds or something like that. And I'm still kind of searching for a player comparison, but I've tossed this one out, and I hate doing it, but like, he reminds me a little bit of Calvin Johnson.
I was just going to say, I'm hoping for Megatron.
And I didn't see Calvin Johnson in high school or anything like that, but I think he can have that type of impact on the outside. He's got excellent ball skills. Some questions about his speed, but hey, this is a guy in the 110 and 300 meter hurdles was a state qualifier, so he can run. And I just love him as a prospect. One of my favorite in the class, and obviously our ranking suggests that as well.
No, that was cool. All right. This is another guy who will be at Chaminade Madonna, just transferred there, I believe. Wide receiver. We actually list him as an athlete in the database. He's got Ohio State. Ohio State's the only warm school for him right now, which I always love. But he's got offers from Alabama, Georgia, LSU. That is JoJo Trader. Great name.
Yeah, JoJo. He was also at that media today, and he was also wearing the same Ohio State slides.
I have that written down. I was making sure I didn't write about the wrong guy.
No, yeah, JoJo's a little bit different. It feels like more like a actual South Florida recruitment. And him and Jeremiah are good friends, right? They kind of visit these schools together. I wouldn't be surprised if we got this time next year, maybe they aren't as attached to the hip. Like, I think some people will try to build them as a package deal, but I don't view it as that. I think at some point,
it's the classic recruiting myth, the package deal.
Right. They never work out. Spoiler. But I think they're going to kind of do their own thing. Now, that doesn't mean they can't both end up at Ohio State. I think that's certainly possible. But Josiah, a little bit different vibe here. And you mentioned we list him as an athlete, and that's because some schools and some college coaches, and even me personally, like, I think he might be a better defensive back than he is a wide receiver, which is insane. Some of your guys, listeners, just to get an idea of how talented Josiah is or what he's capable of. He had a pick six in the state title game when he was at Miami Central, also scored on offense. He was also on SportsCenter's top 10 a few months ago, doing a USA flag football thing, made a one-handed snag in the end zone. And that's kind of his trademark, catching the football with one hand and making it look super easy. So he's talented, but he's already been at 3 high schools in less than a year. Started off at Monsignor Pace, was at Miami Central. I don't know how he played for both teams in the same season, but it happened. And now he's at Chaminade Madonna Prep, and he's going to complement Jeremiah Smith. And that team's going to be super hard to beat. But I do like Ohio State there. I just think his recruitment will be one where the SEC gets involved and he takes some visits. And Miami's obviously in there as well.
Sounds so far like JoJo Trader is the most Floridian Florida guy that we have here. One position I know Ohio State will be focused on, given the way this cycle went, is running back. And Stacy Gage is warm to Ohio State. Here's what I found interesting about Stacy Gage. 4 warm schools, none in Florida. Ohio State, Alabama, USC, and Oklahoma. What does that mean?
He's a national recruit. He's a guy that's been at IMG Academy, or he was at IMG Academy. He's actually left. He's now at Tampa Wharton, I believe, which is where Dijon Johnson goes to school. I think there's a little falling out with the ascenders there at IMG. No, he has toured the country. He's been around. He has seen these other places. And I think at IMG, a lot of these kids, they get around some of the other bigger names at a younger age, and their eyes get open to other possibilities outside the state of Florida. And I do think there's probably a really good chance Stacy ends up signing somewhere outside of Florida, which would kind of buck the trend at IMG. Normally, if a kid comes from a region out of state, right, they go to IMG, then they return to college somewhere in that region. The Carnell Tate, for example, he comes down, goes back to the Midwest at Ohio State, and there's plenty of others. So we'll see what happens. I know he really, really likes Tony Alford, and I think his play style is pretty conducive to the Big Ten Conference, which is more ground and pound and smash mouth. Like, I think he fits that. Speed will be the thing that knocks Stacy Gage. He doesn't run the fastest 40 on the lasers, but he can play, great contact balance, can always find some green grass. So we'll see. I think keeping an eye on the visits this fall will be something to monitor with Stacy Gage. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's someone that makes a decision before he gets into his senior season.
Okay, last one. and I wasn't super familiar with this guy, is cornerback Charles Lester.
Yeah.
I wasn't familiar with him. Here's who was. Good football programs. Here's his 5 warm schools: Alabama, Florida State, Georgia, Michigan, and Ohio State. So shed no tears for Charles during his recruitment, but where will he end up? Tell us a little about him.
Guy I didn't know much about, which sounds crazy. I mean, we ranked him pretty high just based off of film, but he was out at that OT7 event, which is really the premier kind of off-season camp or tournament we had this year. And he looked the part. I think he might have made my all-tournament team, or he was close to making it, or he was on an eye-catcher list. I mean, he's over 6 foot. He's 175 pounds. Two-way player with ball skills, understands how to position himself. And he also makes an impact as a returner on special teams, or he has for his high school. What's interesting with him is he lives about 20 minutes away from IMG Academy. So as it stands right now, Desmond Ricks, Elias Robinson, and Charles Lester, the top 3 ranked quarterbacks in the class of 2023, they all live within like a 30-mile radius of each other. So all cornerback coaches just need to take one flight into there. I don't know where his recruitment really stands. Kind of just asking around. Sounds like Alabama's one to watch. He's been there a few times, and he's also said that Florida State is a little bit of a dream school of sorts. Now, what will be interesting with Florida State is, hey, what happens with Mike Norvell here in year 3? Norvell, his seat's pretty warm. There's a chance he might not get a year 4. If that's the case, who comes in at Florida State, and do they make Charles Lester a priority? I think, that normally happens. We got to remember he's a 23, he's a 24, not a 23. So this coaching shuffle, and really with all these 24s, could have a big impact on what they're thinking.
This just popped into my head here, but if the Florida State job does open up, who do you think they'll go after? I'm asking about one name I'm thinking in my back of my head, but go ahead.
That's a great question. Because I think their offensive coordinator, Alex Atkins, I think he's really, really good. And I think that's a guy that could potentially get a group of 5 head coaching job or a low level power 5 job. I don't really know the answer. I used to kind of have the theory out there that Mark Richt would go to Florida State, and why would you hire Mark Richt as a retread? To me, I think the big thing when you get a retread is you got guys that are going to want to work for him, good assistant coaches. And at the end of the day, yes, talent matters, but coaching certainly can elevate you and get 1 or 2 more wins. And I think Mark Richt would have made a ton of sense, but he's obviously dealing with some health issues right now. He's on ESPN and all that stuff. Dion is the name that will be linked to them all day. Deion Sanders there. And I don't know if Deion Sanders is ready for that Florida State job. I think personally, let's say these 2 job openings were to happen. You had Florida State and Georgia Tech. I think Georgia Tech would make more sense for Deion Sanders. And the city of Atlanta loves him. I think he'd be able to recruit there. And so we'll see. Deion is one, and I haven't come up with my hot board outside of that yet, but Deion will definitely get linked to Florida State.
My question is, and I'm telling you this is going to happen, as amazing as this sounds, everyone's going to talk about Urban Meyer now. Every opening that comes up, he's not going out the way he did, man. That's all I got to say there, but we'll digress. Okay, let's get in some questions here. There was one really good one on here. Okay, yeah. Generally speaking, there's a theory out there that Ryan Day told Dijon if he wanted to keep taking visits, he's going to have to just end up at another school other than Ohio State. Have you heard that? I know a lot of schools that used to be much more prevalent, that a school that if once you committed, if you visited elsewhere, you were done. The teams have backed off that in a lot of cases now, but there seems to be a lot of people saying that Day has told Dijon, S or off the P.
Again, from what I've heard, there's a lot of stuff going on in Dijon's life right now.
Personal kind of stuff.
And I think the mentors and the people around him have told him to kind of hit the brakes and take a step back. And I think that's one of the reasons why he opened it up. I mean, I think he should have opened it up before he took those Florida visits. In terms of these schools trying to leverage themselves, we've seen that work to some degree, I think, at Clemson, but Clemson also saw 3 of their top commits walk away last cycle, and the trio from IMG Academy. And I was actually out at a personnel convention symposium this past week, and this was a topic that was brought up about committable offers, and some schools implementing a policy about kids not visiting other places. And the guy that was like leading this conversation was a Clemson staffer. And I'm like, of course, man, it's easy for you to say this, but all these other schools might not have that same leverage and capability. I don't know what Ryan Day is saying. I will say this. I do think it's interesting how many official visits Ohio State, or how many official visitors they brought in during the summer months. It wasn't too long ago where we didn't have these official visits,
right,
and now they are. And I think so many people were eager to use them. And it's like, now, do you want to save those type of things? And obviously Ohio State's in a different situation than everyone else, or a lot of schools, given where they're located. So, we'll see. That's what I got there.
No, the Dijon one there's always one every cycle that is a novel into itself. Hopefully he's making like a documentary film about this, because it would be super entertaining. All right, let's finish with this. When nobody else is around from Ohio, and you guys in South Florida talk to the coaches and the players down there, and the topic of Ohio State comes up, how is Ohio? I mean, I know Ohio State's viewed as a powerhouse, et cetera, but in detail, maybe, like these guys that are considering, the Florida kids that consider Ohio State, Georgia, LSU, and Alabama. What are they really deciding between? Where does Ohio State fit in the hierarchy? Just kind of let our people eat up some Ohio information.
Well, the current landscape has changed a lot, I think, over the past 6, 7, 8 months, just with NIL, right? So I always get asked this question: hey, is NIL playing a factor in college football recruiting? And I'm like, yes, every conversation starts and revolves around NIL. Ask a college coach, and if they say it doesn't, they're lying to you. I mean, at all different levels, NIL is discussed. So I think that's changed a dynamic a little bit. But Ohio State, anytime a kid gets an offer from Ohio State, that is absolutely a big deal down here in South Florida. I think it's a big deal anywhere in Florida. I think anytime, me personally, I see a kid get an offer from Ohio State, I fully expect them to visit and go through the process with the Buckeyes. And I think Ohio State at the same time is very calculated about most of the kids that they do offer. I know they do their homework. Hey, is this kid going to fit what we want to do up there in Columbus? And I do think they do a good job of identifying those right type of guys. We'll see what happens with Jeremiah Smith. Again, I like where they stand there. And I like the pieces they got from American Heritage. Brandon Inniss, to me, is someone that's going to transform that locker room, or maybe not, but he's going to be a voice in that locker room. And I think where we are right now with the transfer portal, with NIL, those are the most valuable players you can add. Guys that want to be there and guys that want to win. So I think they're doing a good job. And I think the Ohio State brand, I mean, it definitely carries some weight down here. I go back to the NFL draft when Ohio State had the wide receivers selected back to back, or, back to back, whatever you want to call it. Like, I saw a lot of Florida kids.
We'll take back to back, just like we take Joe Burrow.
I saw a lot of Florida kids and recruits talking about that. I mean, I always bring it up, wide receiver U. And I think what they've done with pass rushers, I think that's also certainly notable. Larry Johnson, that's a name that's very well respected anytime you talk to a defensive lineman down here. And I know they didn't get John Walker. We'll see what happens with that one. But, elite edge players have taken notice of the Bosas and the Chase Youngs of the world.
We all wish the Bosas just would have had more children. Believe me. Jack Sawyer, you're up. Ladies and gentlemen, if you stood for the whole show, that's 38 minutes of solid gold. Andrew, my hopes were high for your first appearance. I don't know if you want to hear this, but you've guaranteed yourself many return appearances. So that was the best you can get. He's the best at it in South Florida right now. Like I said, people, 247 Sports, we are really blessed right now with, after what, a decade, almost 15 years, we've whittled it down to some of the best in the business. I honestly believe we have the best recruiting guys in the business at every spot. And Andrew is just another example of that. So we appreciate him stopping by. You have a good one, Bucknutters.